And there we go. I think we are live. Here I am again. Let me just proceed to invite our guests first so we get rid of the technical complications first. Let's see if this works. Just waiting for our guests to connect. Hi everyone in the meantime. I see that people are joining. Hello, hello. Thank you so much for coming in. All right, so while we are waiting for the guests to be joining, as always, welcome back to another Pulse community session. My name is Diana, and I am the community manager here at Human Rights Pulse. I think that by now this has become your mantra to know that my name is Diana and I'm the community manager, but maybe for those of you who do not know that. And yeah, today we're going to discuss a crucially important topic. So today we're going to address the legal limits of the emergency powers that indeed have emerged under the coronavirus regulations. So just let me see. Our guest is just joining. Sorry for that. Yes, he should be joining right now. Sorry, my speech just got cut there, but... Oh, hi, Niall. Hi there.
Hi, Dana.
Hello, hello. So I was just starting introducing today's topics. I was just saying that today we're going to discuss a crucially important a subject, which is indeed the extent of the emergency power that have been introduced under the coronavirus regulations. And I was just going to say a very brief disclaimer. So obviously, notwithstanding whatever we're going to say today, nobody is downplaying the magnitude and scale of the pandemic clearly. So nobody is saying that we should just be going out and about doing our own business as if nothing had happened and that the effects of the pandemic are not as devastating as they are. But it is incredibly important to just stop for a second and reassess the measures that we're under, because when we're dealing with such a psychological conditioning and fear, that kind of fear can have a very, very powerful grip on people's minds. So it is very, very important to just stop and think for a second. So yeah, let me introduce you our guest Niall today. So Niall is an advocate at the Scottish Bar. That would be the equivalent of a barrister, as they call it in England and Wales. He has been called to the bar in 1995, which makes it more than 25 years of experience by now. So we're absolutely grateful and proud to have you as our guest. Niall specializes in criminal law and human rights, and he has extensive experience in extradition cases, as well as criminal appeal cases, including murder as well. And he also has experience with employment, immigration, and prisoners' rights cases. So this makes it for a strong introduction for you to understand the guest that we have today. So I'm absolutely excited to be talking to you, Niall. Yeah, so I guess, what's the situation at present in Scotland? I just recently came back, and the only thing that I'm seeing everywhere is COVID regulations, tier 1, tier 5. What is happening at present, legally speaking?
Well, what the government, well, and I think it's probably important to explain how the Scottish government operates in relation to COVID, is that back in March, the UK government, which deals with matters which are what they call reserved matters, so that's matters that affect the whole of the UK, the UK Parliament passed the Coronavirus Act, and within that act, they had powers that were thereafter delegated to the Scottish government so that they could then form their own regulations as to how to deal with the coronavirus. Because by and large, the way the Coronavirus Act is framed is as a health response. And of course, health is a devolved power to the Scottish government and the Scottish Parliament. So because it's primarily being dealt with as a health issue, those powers were delegated to the Scottish government. And so what they've done since then is they've issued regulations which do not go through the Scottish Parliament. This is subordinate legislation, which doesn't require to be voted on, and then they can introduce these regulations, which of course had such a dramatic effect on everyone's lives. I think it's important to remember, though, that as far as Scotland's concerned, there has been some debate in the Scottish Parliament, and indeed there's been some votes, but these have been kind of almost like ad hoc, and they've not been required. The key piece of legislation that was done in the normal way with apparent scrutiny was the Coronavirus Act itself. But I think what's important to remember is it's a huge piece of legislation, and it went through the Parliament in about a day. So there's no way it had the proper scrutiny that and normally such a complex piece of legislation would have. Thereafter, the Scottish Government have put in regulations which, of course, like everywhere in Europe and other parts of the world, affect pretty much every area of our lives.
Absolutely. I was indeed just going to ask you, I should have asked you this before. I think there is such a huge confusion between what is a rule, what is a regulation, what is the actual act of parliament that has been passed. So I think this already in and of itself constitutes a problem for the citizens, because we are not capable at present due to this very complexity of the act itself and all the governmental advice that surrounds the act. We are not able to properly plan our activities accordingly. And indeed, as you mentioned, the fact that such a complex act has been just rushed through Parliament, this makes it for an effective lack of scrutiny and opposition. So what do you, I was reading an article about Lord Sumption being incredibly concerned about Britain becoming he went so far as in saying a police state. Now this can be debatable, but he really emphasized this lack of parliamentary scrutiny. What do you think in that respect?
Well, I would agree with Lord Sumption that when you look at the original act, there's no way, it just would not have been practically possible to have the kind of scrutiny you'd expect for a big piece of legislation. But really, that's just the starting point in a way, because once the Scottish Government, and that's what I've been focused on mostly, is what's happening in Scotland. Once they've got these powers, then they've been able to bring in, regulations on a regular basis. And it's that process. Once you get to that process, of course, there is no requirement for them to put those regulations through the Scottish Parliament. They have had some debates as a courtesy to the other parties, and indeed they did have a vote on the 5-tier system that's now in force. We'll no doubt talk about that in a minute. But there's no requirement to do that. It's simply it's almost like an act of generosity, and that's not, of course, how a democracy should operate. So, I mean, I think police states probably a bit strong, but certainly there seems to be a lack of questioning by people you would expect to be questioning. Even lawyers, for example, you see a kind of lack of questioning what's going on, and very much a kind of sense of, well, there's nothing we can do about it, we'll just have to accept it. That seems to be the kind of general reaction you get from a lot of people, which is worrying.
Exactly. Like I think the thing that was worrying me precisely as a citizen, but also like in the more academic debate, is that even when there was a clear failure on, say, police or whatever other executive force to respect the limit set, the justification was that, oh, but we are in an emergency, so actually you should be grateful that we are even giving you the possibility to go for your 1-hour walk a day or whatever that might be. So that is indeed very, very concerning. Just as a matter of summary, or to put it all in a bubble, what human rights are at stake in this discourse specifically? What do you think are the groups of people that are particularly impacted by the severity of these unprecedented restraints?
Well, I suppose if you look at it in, say, European Convention terms, so I suppose the one that would get the most attention would be, Article 1, Protocol 1 of the European Convention, which is, property rights. So you see the right to work effectively being diminished. So many people will have lost a lot of money. So even if they've had the benefit of the furlough scheme, for some people, particularly at the lower end of the socioeconomic order, I would have thought a 20% reduction would be pretty severe. And of course, there doesn't seem to be any attempt on the government to make up that particular gap in certain people's finances. A lot of people who are self-employed who maybe earn above a threshold, I think the threshold was something like 50 grand, I can't remember, it was 50 grand a year, something like that. They were getting nothing at all, nothing, no compensation. They could have lost tens of thousands of pounds by now. Businesses have folded, potentially without compensation. And certainly businesses that are continuing to survive are, hotels, for example, some of them are reporting being 20% full most of the time. So, you see a huge effect from an Article 1, Protocol 1. That would be the most striking. Article 8, right to a private life. That, I think, is pretty self-evident. At the moment in Scotland, it is not legal. If you said, Niall, you want to come round for a nice meal tonight? I couldn't come. We'd both be breaking the law. And we couldn't meet. We can't even meet on a pub right now. So there's a very severe restraint on people's lives. People don't have control even what's happening in their own homes. And of course, that's, I suppose, just exemplified by Christmas, for example. It's just one example, though, of the fact that the state is telling you what you can and cannot do in your own home. That is something that none of us would ever expect. It's certainly unprecedented in recent memory, certainly in a country like the UK. And again, whilst I wouldn't want to make any comparisons with, going back to when, likes of Italy or Greece or Germany were totalitarian states, or East Germany, it's not as extreme as that. It's nowhere near as extreme as that. But you'd have to go back in time to those points to get those levels of intervention in people's private lives. So, those come the right to education, where you have children who were simply told to go home in March and told to come back in August. They were not at school for 5 months. It's extraordinary. And even now, the disruption continues. There's been a lot of, I know in a school in Edinburgh right now, there was a whole second year that was told to go home because I think they had 3 COVID cases. So, no doubt they'll carry on their education over the internet, but there's a point there to be made that certainly the state schools in Scotland were very poor in providing a strong alternative. There was some education provided in that 5-month period, but they had, and this is part of the absurdity of COVID, is there was all sorts of things like, well, because 20% of families don't have a laptop, we can't teach online because we can't teach everyone. You say, well, what you should do then as the state is say, we will provide those 20% who don't have a laptop with a laptop, and we will then make sure that everyone's education carries on pretty much as normal. But certainly in the state schools, the kids were getting maybe a couple of hours a day, but often it wasn't like a Zoom type thing. It was, they get sent an email saying, here's the work you've got to do on your own. It's pretty poor, really. I don't think the cancellation of the exams, you wonder how that will affect people academically. If and they're not even ruled out this year, they may cancel the hires as well in Scotland. So that would mean that you'd have people going to university without ever having done a serious exam. How are they going to cope with university exams when they've not? It's like asking a footballer to play in the Premier League when they've never played for their school team. It's you've got to build up that kind of experience. So I think that there's a lot of potential human rights. Whether you would win a human rights legal argument is a different matter, of course, because proportionality is always going to be a factor. And the European Court of Human Rights would always say, well, first of all, they're going to allow a margin of appreciation.
I actually wanted to, sorry, I'm just furiously scribbling and taking notes because I think you touched upon.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I think you just cut it. No, I was just going to say that I was picking up on words that you said, specifically proportionality, that I would also like to tie in with subsidiarity, margin of appreciation, and all that discourse, because I think something that is fundamental at the moment, I think, is this proportionality notion. So especially with the right of education that you just mentioned, that to me, and not because I'm at university at the moment or because I'm personally affected, absolutely not, I'm thinking about children specifically, is really disproportionate in the sense that we are creating a generational not even gap, but generational damage, in the sense that we are potentially ruining and precluding a whole generation from having a decent right to education, a decent education at all, not canceling exams, not allowing them to have access to the resources. So say, for example, at present in in Scotland, how would a legal argument challenge that? So if a mom or the parents of a kid would like to complain against the fact that their kid fundamental right to education is precluded, how would a legal argument be construed?
Well, we have procedure by judicial review. So if you were to challenge a decision of a state body, you have to show that the decision is unreasonable. We have a test of reasonableness. So you'd have to show that what they'd done was unreasonable. So if you look at the exams, for example, I would not be surprised if we see actions in relation to exams. I mean, we know that the National 5 exams for 15-year-olds, so that kind of age group, 15, 16-year-olds, they're already cancelled. I would expect to see there to be a challenge to that. And if the hires go, and that's usually 16, 17-year-olds, I think there'd definitely be a challenge to that. And I think there'd be parents who'd be concerned that even if their child was going to get a grade, of course there was a big fiasco about the allocation of grades, they would then be thinking, well, is my child really equipped for the next part of their education? Is it reasonable that they shouldn't sit that they've been excused from sitting some form of exam? Because at the end of the day, I think an exam could be set up differently. It could be set up online, for example. There's all sorts of ways. With a bit of imagination, you could have an exam. And I think that's what's sometimes lacking. I think a lot of the measures that the government have employed, well, not just in Scotland, right across Europe, really, perhaps with the exception of Sweden. And I know there's difficulties with Sweden as well. I mean, but you look at other countries, which in some countries, of course, are a lot stricter than the UK. I mean, Spain, I would say, is a lot stricter than the UK in many ways. But you look at some of the measures and you think they don't seem reasonable. They don't seem. It seems very much it's a wrecking ball approach. You know, it's not targeted particularly in a lot of areas. So I think politicians like to be seen to be doing something, and I think that's what we've seen too much of. You know, by probably right across most of Western Europe.
Yeah, indeed. It is very concerning. And you were very right there in pointing out to the fact that we are having this discussion about the UK, but comparing it to the European situation, Spain and Italy. So I only just recently came back from Italy. And I stress I came back to my home, which is Scotland. So I've not just traveled to Scotland because I like Scotland so much, which I do. But I had reasons to come to Scotland. I think the unreasonableness of the measures has reached a crucially unacceptable point. So, for example, in the news today, I was reading that a person was fined €400 for the mere fact that while in an empty square, he stopped his motorbike and took the mask off his face to answer the phone, which is permitted legally under a clause in the new governmental decree. And the police, now I don't recall exactly what the police justification was, but he got fined. Now he clearly is going to appeal that fine, and successfully, hopefully, because as I said, there is a specific clause in law stating that he was allowed to do so. But it just shows how the executive forces seem to be drunk on power, because there is no, even like in common sense, so forgetting about all the legal aspects of it, why would you want to find a person in an empty square? And actually, by approaching him, you are contributing to the spread, if we want to put it under this argument, because it is so. So it shows that the line the line is blurred, and that there is no the limit of the power is completely disregarded. So I would totally agree that there are much more stricter lockdowns and so on, and not even to mention the fact that in countries which are not Europe, the situation is even worse, which has exacerbated problems with problematic governments or crimes and so on and so forth. But maybe I can ask you something about that, because in relation to crime, and you are an expert in the field, what about the rate of domestic abuse domestic abuse, or the position of women in households with all these restrictions and everything that they're subject to? How does that work?
Well, I think there's just the general understanding is that, and I don't have all the stats to hand, but certainly everything I read about it is that domestic abuse has gone up. And I think you could understand that, because if you look at the kind of pathology of an abuser, abusers are often driven by stress. So part of their unhealthy coping mechanism, that's an extremely unhealthy coping mechanism, is to take it out on their partner. So they're more stressed. They're probably drinking more. And so they're more claustrophobic. So first of all, they've got more pent-up aggression. The victim can't get away, and it's because the moment it would be, although I think in an emergency, I don't think it would be unlawful, for example, to rush into a neighbour's house. They'd be thinking, oh, I can't go into someone else's house right now, and so they would feel inhibited from taking the sort of action to get themselves out of the situation. And I think there'd be a general perception that charities and so on, and bodies that help, are not functioning as fully as they normally do. And so they'd be thinking, well, maybe the support that I might have got isn't there as well. And then they might be thinking, well, we've got an epidemic. The police don't want me turning up at the police station. They've got other things to think about. There's so many hurdles to getting help. So you can see that the context of abuse is increased. That also applies not just to domestic violence, but that would be domestic sexual abuse as well. And again, the abuser who is acting in these grossly inappropriate ways to cope with their own problems, who is, again, as I said before, drinking more. The victim is available more. They can't get away. They that sort of thing's increasing as well. And again, the same obstacles would apply to trying to extricate yourself from the situation or to report it. So, definitely. The problem with this type of crime, of course, is that often it takes a while for it to be reported. But I can definitely envisage, being in these, and when I do a lot of these types of cases, and often they are reported even years after the fact. I would not surprise me if we see a few years down the road lots of cases coming through the courts that say during the COVID period, the abuse that was visited upon me was greatly exacerbated by the situation.
Yeah, 100%. This is indeed a very grim prospect, and this backlog of cases. Well, first of all, the fact that it is already very difficult for the victim to report it in the first place, notwithstanding a pandemic. But we are all very much concerned with this backlog of cases that the courts are going to have. And indeed, you mentioned before the fact that the victim is going to be hindered because she or he might think that the police station is too preoccupied with something else, or I can't go in someone else's home. And I see a parallel here with people getting access to actual hospitals. So like, I'm moving away from the criminal sphere, which is bad enough, but there's another one which concerns me as well. And that paradoxically precludes the very right to health to a particular piece of the population. So what are we seeing in Scotland, but not only in Scotland? I think this is a general trend. So with people being denied treatment, and how does that work at present?
Well, I think that what I've certainly come to understand is that there's concerns that we may end up with 2 other types of death for every 3 COVID deaths. So because of delays, particularly in things like cancer treatment, and then I know there's some figures published in England today where the percentage of people who are on waiting lists of over a year now has greatly increased. So people that are waiting over a year to get treatment for various conditions. So I think that the problem with the whole COVID thing is that in every area you can look at, there's been this tunnel vision, and the health service is a particular example of it. A tunnel vision, everything's about COVID. Now, you are in the academic kind of world, and I know from speaking to academics, if they've got a research project right now that's related to COVID, that's the funding's there straight away, no problem. If they go in with anything else, no one's interested. It's this obsession with COVID, and whilst it's a serious problem, it's become out of proportion. So yesterday, for example, Richard Lochhead, the education minister in Scotland, said, for example, he said, there's been 5,700 deaths today from COVID in the world. But in actual fact, every day, 150,000 people die in the world. You know, and that's just a stat. People talk about over 1 million deaths worldwide from COVID, but every week there'll be 1 million deaths in the world. That's normal. 50,000 deaths in the UK every year. Every month we have 50,000 deaths in the UK. 600,000 deaths a year. And so these stats, they sound horrendous, but in actual fact, when you look at them in that context, it's also, I think that, and again, if you look at the average age of the deaths, now in Scotland, the average life expectancy for a female is 81. The average female death from COVID is 84. The average life expectancy for a male in Scotland is 77, and the average COVID death for a male is 79. And it really, so you can see it is, and I don't mean to devalue age, but it's much more of a threat for people of a certain age. People under 30 who are having incredible restrictions in their education, just their whole lifestyle, really. In Scotland, only one person under 30 has died of COVID. And I think, I don't know the case, but I would be willing to bet there's a lot of complex comorbid factors. So the way information is being presented by government is very, very important here, in that it's not being put in a proper context very often. And I think that there is exaggerated fears about COVID. I mean, I'm not saying it's not a significant problem. It is, but it has to be seen in context. It's over exaggerated, and the response is too extreme.
Do you think that this way in which information is being presented and the propagandistic behavior of the government, and once again, for those people who are listening to us, I know we are talking specifically about Scotland, but I really do think that this can be a very general discussion applicable to all the countries, to a different extent, of course, but the core of the argument remains the same. Do you think that there could be an argument here against, well, not against, to say that freedom of speech is being curtailed, so that, for example, academic papers that are seeking to prove not the contrary, but to show this exaggeration and to provide other solutions, the fact that those are being curtailed or put on the shelves, can a successful argument of freedom of speech impeachment be successful indeed? Or even the freedom of association, so say protests. I know in Italy a series of protests have emerged that ended up badly for other reasons, but yeah, people, there is this public sentiment of turmoil because people feel increasingly more restricted. Is there an argument to make that yeah, our fundamental freedom of speech or association are too curtailed at this stage?
I think that probably not in a human rights law sense. I mean, it's not as, for example, you and I are having a discussion here, and the authorities are not trying to close it down. If we were in China having a discussion the state didn't like particularly, this stream would have been cut off by now. So yes, we can still have the discussion. I think the question is more the prominence that certain people are given within the media. So say, for example, in Scotland, an academic who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, Professor Linda Bald, who's the chair of public health at Edinburgh, she is constantly trotted out as the COVID expert. And I've got a lot of respect for her. I'm not necessarily in a position to properly agree or disagree with her, but I would say she's quite a conservative commentator and is generally pro-government and makes some critical noises. But so she's trotted out as the expert. She's on, like Radio Scotland almost every day, and you're not hearing many other experts in her field coming on. I'm not saying there's not been any. The BBC have had alternative voices sometimes, but not often. So there are alternative voices, but I think that they're kind of given much less airtime and much less prominence. They're trotted out every so often to kind of try and attempt to show some sort of balance. But I think that the party line is very much being adopted, and in Scotland as well. The First Minister is having live press briefings every single day and really getting, tremendous coverage out of it. It's incredible propaganda from her point of view. So it's what often happens in democratic societies is we don't have thought control as such, but it's more the selections, how things are selected. So there's been plenty of criticism about this sort of stuff in the past, Noam Chomsky and people like that. And I think what we're seeing now is maybe just an extension of that, there's a certain line that they're prepared to have the odd dissident here and there, but as soon as something a bit controversial is raised, well, we'll have a small dose of that, but not too much of that, thank you very much. I think I was on Radio Scotland and I mentioned that there was a democratic deficit. And, the presenter really came back at me, I felt quite strongly. And I said, well, there has to be a democratic deficit if these regulations, which are controlling and restricting every area of people's lives, are not being properly scrutinised or debated in the Scottish Parliament. So I think that it is almost blatant that there's a democratic deficit. The question isn't really whether there's a democratic deficit. That definitely exists in my view. The question isn't also, is there a severe restriction of civil liberties? That's all definite. You cannot argue those things. The real question is it proportionate? Now, the government are always putting forward the argument that it is proportionate, and there's plenty of supporters that would agree with them. My argument has always been about proportionality. That is the balance right? There are many people in our society who the lockdown is creating much greater stress than any concerns they have about the disease.
Yeah, indeed. I fully agree with that. And I think that even the mere fact that the way in which the radio reporter came back at you very strongly when you attempted at saying that there might be a democratic deficit is a proof in itself that actually we might very well dealing with a democratic deficit, which is something incredibly concerning. Do you think that the government will be, I know this might be a cliched question because this whole discussion points in the direction of a no, but do you think that the government will be willing to then give away the powers that it had accumulated by now once the threat will be taken down? Actually, is there a willingness to even consider a situation, the so-called exit strategy? Do you think that we will be ever moving towards that direction, or are we just will we just live with restrictions for an indefinite amount of time?
Well, I don't think an indefinite amount of time. I think it's all going to depend on the vaccine to an extent, really. I think obviously there was a lot of joy the other day when it was announced that there was a vaccine that may be available relatively soon, and I think there was back to normal by the spring, which would be tremendous. I think we'd all say hurrah to that. And also, even built into the Coronavirus Act, there is actually a sunset clause. So it was passed in March 25th, I think. So there is a sunset clause for March of 2022. But if the vaccine doesn't work out, then one could envisage a scenario where, notwithstanding the sunset clause, that the Parliament agree to extend the powers of the Act for another period. So it's difficult. I think it all comes down to the vaccine right now. I think if the vaccine's a way out for the government as well, because they've set aboard a strategy, right? We're going to suppress this virus, and they've, in their own haphazard way, that's what they've set out to do, with arguable success or arguable lack of success, depending on how you look at it. And they definitely see the kind of messages that the vaccine is the panacea that they are looking for, basically.
Yeah, I wouldn't know whether to fully agree with that, but yeah, especially considering the amount of people who seem to be contrary, the so-called anti-vaxxers, and I wouldn't know how that will be dealt with, but that is completely a story for another day. But how is this whole ordeal impacted the legal business? So in the same way as, say, the people are impeached in their accessing effectively health or other treatments, how is access to justice being impacted in Scotland at the moment?
Well, I mean, I do mostly sort of jury trials, and there was a period. Well, so when the lockdown came in, all the jury trials were suspended. I think they were effectively suspended for about 6 months before because they had to work on a new system. So we now just started a new system whereby juries are seeing cases remotely. So they're actually in a cinema. It's quite a clever thing that's been put together. It's a bit like something out of Blade Runner or some sci-fi movie. Jurors are in a cinema, and there's all sorts of cameras which can see them, and we see them, and then we have a big screen in the room so we can see them, and then they can see us, and they can see the witness and so on. So, I mean, trials are back up and running, and that's a good thing. But we've also got a colossal backlog now. So people are, Scotland has always been renowned for very short periods of time in custody. We used to have a very strict 110-day rule. You're in custody for 110 days, and then your trial started. And if the state failed to bring you to trial, you were released and never prosecuted again. That changed a long time ago. We were already starting to get much more in the way of a backlog, but we've got a serious backlog now, and people spending 15 months before a trial. And of course, I know certain European countries have had that for a long time. Countries like Spain, you could spend 2 years waiting for a trial, but we didn't have that, and now we've got that. Complainers in cases, including very sensitive cases like rape cases, they're waiting a hell of a long time to get into court, so there's huge delays which are anxious making for accused persons and for witnesses in cases, just bad for a sense of justice overall, and we're going to have a backlog, I think, for a considerable period of time.
Is it true that they wanted to, I now I don't remember exactly the justice who said that, but I read somewhere in the news that actually online courts would have been the norm from now on. Is this something that is going to happen, or especially from your personal experience, practical experience, do you think that this statement of online courts will become the norm is true?
Well, I think for what we're doing in jury trials, the answer would be no, because hiring these cinemas costs a lot of money. So the Scottish Courts Administration will want to get jury trials back the way they were as soon as possible. But pretty much every other type of case could be done in a virtual way. I mean, I've done a couple of virtual appeals, for example, and it's a bit strange. I personally don't think it's as good a way to perform advocacy. It's very good for things like straightforward procedural hearings. You sort of think, well, what's the point in everyone traveling for a straightforward procedural hearing, and for certain straightforward, even substantive hearings. But if there's any complexity to a case, I don't think it's a good thing for it to be done remotely. But I think there will be a lot more remote hearings, and particularly in our tribunal system. So, give you an example. Someone I know who's a mental health judge, part-time, an advocate. So sometimes she would say before COVID, she'd be maybe instructed to go and sit in Aberdeen and do a case up there, but now she can do Aberdeen in the morning and say Dumfries in the afternoon, and they're miles apart, as you know. So they get two for the price of one. There's no travel costs, there's no accommodation costs, so it's probably going to cost them about 40% of what it was costing before, and they can do it all virtually. So I think that type of thing will stay, because the Scottish Courts Administration will say, look, all the money we're saving, why bother having real live hearings? I mean, there might be many situations where, I mean, I personally, for me, I'd never heard of Zoom before lockdown. Now it's great. Someone says to me, I want to have a consultation in Glasgow, just do it on Zoom. It's great. And I think this type of remote thing, like when you're doing, even like what we're doing right now, it works quite well with just two people. And I think the more complex things become, though. So if you're doing a remote hearing where there's maybe 3 judges in the appeal court, and there's different parties, and there's a clerk of court, that doesn't work great in a remote setting. I think that's the difference for me. I also think that you lose this. I mean, law is a social business, and I don't think that it's quite the same to, it just doesn't feel quite the same. I don't think. I also, we haven't even remotely considered the long-term effects of all this. I mean, my hobby is triathlon, and I was reading one of the triathlon blogs yesterday. One of the coaches, and he was saying, well, you could have someone, for example, who is very fit, so say a triathlete who trains twice a day, but if they have a job where they're working at home and they're on Zoom all day, that experience, even if they're very fit, could make them actually very unhealthy. And so, say for example, I'm slightly digressing here, this office culture, everyone works at home now. That's not necessarily a healthy thing, because if you work in an office environment, you're moving around a lot, you're getting quite a lot of physical exercise, and you're probably interacting socially a lot more. So we haven't even considered what the long-term physical and mental health effects are of this type of remote world that we're creating. I mean, I'm not some sort of Luddite. I embrace Zoom and so on because for me, in certain situations, it saves a hell of a lot of time, and I really like it, but I just don't want it for everything.
I completely agree. I think the key here is flexibility, but to the discretion of the person involved. So before you were referring to the imagination when dealing with exams. So government, I think on one hand, government and the whole population has been incredibly imaginative in coming up with ways to deal with all of this, which is honestly fantastic to see. Like, look what we've created. But at the same time, it is very distressing. I also certainly don't want to live in a virtual world forever and be doing happy hours over Zoom with my friends for the rest of my life. And I think that the positive take of that is this flexibility. So flexibility must be something that has to be mandatorily taken into account, but not just remotely, or like not to become an excuse for choosing absolutes. So either all home or all office, because it becomes toxic in either ways. So I once again fully agree, and I think it's quite scary to think about the long-term effects of everything that we're just witnessing, from the backlog of cases, the right to education, the generational effect of this wave that is going to have. So yeah, 100%. Do you have?
I mean, we've not even touched. There's so many things we've not even touched on. For example, mental health, but we've not touched on things like this. Some of the COVID rules have been so strict. So, for example, some people weren't even able to get into hospital to see a relative who was dying. You hear about women who were going for the scans and their partner wasn't able to go, and then being, getting some terrible news, about the child that they thought was going to be well, and then being told that this wasn't going to be a happy outcome for them. You hear of people not being able to go to funerals and so on. The long-term psychological consequences of that sort of stuff has not been factored in as well. I mean, it's incredible the hardship that some people have had to endure because of the I think, overt strictness of some of the rules. And then there's also a great arbitrariness about some of the rules. So masks, for example, quite weak evidence that masks work. Particularly, I mean, a lot of us wear the kind of cloth masks that maybe look a bit better than a paper mask, but they're definitely not as effective as a proper hospital mask. But the other thing, some people who do wear proper hospital masks, they're taking them off and putting them on all day. How that can possibly, you'd really need to replace them every time you took them on and off. So there's very, very weak evidence that masks are doing anything. And yet we're all wandering around with masks. And in some countries like Spain, they're even having to wear masks outside.
In Italy as well.
And Italy as well, with no great evidence that they're of any effective use at all. So there's a lot of issues here. So yeah, we don't know the effects long term. I mean, we'll just have to wait and see. It's a very, very strange situation because I think some of the rules. So, for example, some rules are very easy to understand. I think no one would suggest let's have an Old Firm match for Celtic and Rangers, 50,000 fans. Yeah. No one's suggesting let's have a big rock festival with Radiohead headlining. We just can't have these things right now. You can't have mass gatherings like that. But so that would be an absurdity to suggest we do that. But what is not as absurdity is to say, well, let's say you're having an Old Firm game, St Rangers. Why can't you have 1,000 fans there? These stadiums are huge. They could be socially distanced apart from each other. You could have quite strict rules about gathering outside and so on. So it's this kind of, it's very much this wrecking ball approach, that it's just like, no, we're not allowing that, we're allowing this, and incredible inconsistencies. We saw that in Scotland recently when there was the fiasco about what's a restaurant, what's a cafe, what's a pub, and for some people there's very little to distinguish all three of them, because there are cafes and restaurants you can get a drink in, and there's pubs that are actually more focused on food than they are on drink. So it's so much the decision making seems quite arbitrary and based on this. And the other thing, and you touched on this earlier, this confusion between guidance and regulations. So much of what is spouted out by politicians is actually guidance. So remember, in the main lockdown start, things like, for example, you can only exercise an hour a day, you can only exercise once a day, you can only exercise within 5 miles of your home. That was never law. That was always guidance. But there were people phoning the police saying, "Oh, my neighbour's been out. They've been out running for 1 hour and 1 minute." It's insane.
100%. I think at that very moment it was incredibly crazy how the social conditioning played a role, which I think is probably, or at least personally, the thing that concerns me the most, because I think that certainly to induce that pressure that government is undeniably exercising, you have to instill a subtle apparatus whereby the people are policing themselves. And that is, we know how it ends with the secret police and the state police. And again, this is an exaggeration, of course. Nobody's suggesting that we actually are in a police state. But what I've witnessed in March specifically was this curtain. I don't even remember how they defined it, but just looking out the curtain and see, oh, the neighbor is actually in the streets walking for 2 hours instead of 1 hour, which was never even law to begin with. So this is once again incredibly concerning, and we should be keeping an eye on that. And I guess, do you have, as a lawyer, as a practitioner, do you have any advice for the population, as in both intellectually or practically, as in what to do to keep an eye on these restrictions or vocalize concerns?
I suppose there's two things there. I think it's very difficult to keep an eye on what restrictions are. I mean, I think even lawyers would struggle to keep up to date with the changes in regulations and the difference between what's a guideline and what's a regulation. I regularly tell people who are not lawyers what they might raise an issue with me, and I'll say, no, you don't need to worry about that because that's just a guideline. So even lawyers struggle with it. In terms of what they should do, I think that more people need to be contacting their MPs and MSPs and saying, look, come on, this is excessive. This is disproportionate. This is affecting my business. This is affecting my child's mental health. This is affecting everyone's well-being. I think part of the problem, and what we've seen in a lot of countries, and the UK is no different for this, is sort of like politicians procrastinating, the situation getting worse, then lock down hard and things get better, and then ease up maybe, and then the numbers start to rise again, then lock down hard again. And so we see this constant oscillation. And out of Scotland, we've got this 5-tier thing, so we'd be expected to oscillate in those 5 tiers for the foreseeable future. I go back to Sweden, and I know there's controversy around it as well, but the Swedes at least did seem to have a consistent approach. They sort of said, right, we're bringing some restrictions, we're playing the long game here. Now, they initially did do worse than their neighbours. They made a mess of the care homes like we did, but they're probably not doing that much worse than their neighbours now. They're doing better than we are, and they seem to have a stable approach, which isn't panicked. And it's like saying, well, there are limits to what we can do, and we've got to balance it out properly with other things that are happening in our society. And I think that's where we've gone so badly wrong, is that we've got this boom bust approach, this oscillation between lockdown hard, ease up, lockdown hard. That's no way to live. No person or business can regulate themselves on that kind of way. We don't have a steady approach at all. And it's just this constant sense of reacting to things kind of almost on a kind of ad hoc basis. There's no stability right now.
100%. Yeah, indeed. Like this lack of this perpetual psychological and legal uncertainties is very deeply undermining everyone's mental health and physical health, and just a society at large, I would say, the normal operation of society at large. So we cannot but hope that better times will come. So yeah, totally. I was just wanted to touch upon the point of contacting the MPs and MSPs. So like, of course, we're talking MSPs is the Scottish Members of Parliament, for those of you in the audience who do not know. But I think this is so important in every country. So whoever is listening to us right now, do not ever forget that you do have avenues to contact the people that are elected to represent you. So contact MSPs, if you're living in Scotland, contact the whatever representative might be in the local council or whatever, because that is a crucial right that citizens have, and is the only way that we can voice our concerns and actually affect change. Because too often, and once again, this might be cliched, but too often we think that we do not make a difference, but we actually do. And if we start to using the mechanisms that we have, because there are mechanisms, then things might well be better. And I have a quote right before starting this. I was reading something that I've got in my room, a quote from Jenny Holzer, which is, "Abuse of power comes as no surprise." So I guess also looking at the time, we are almost running out of time. We could conclude on this very important quote that, again, abuse of power is no surprise. Nobody ends up in a totalitarian regime overnight with all the civil liberties and rights deprived. It is a process that takes time, and that becomes more and more entrenched until you have no choice. So I don't know if this became almost an appeal, urging the people to do something or to be very attentive. But yeah, I think it's absolutely fundamental. And I think you, Niall, will want to agree with that, right?
Absolutely, and yeah, thanks very much for having me on. Been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for us. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much. And as always, for the audience, those talks are going to be posted on our Instagram page and on YouTube as well. So you can always rewatch them if you didn't manage to catch us. And yeah, as always, thank you so much, and have a lovely night, everyone. Bye bye. Thank you so much, Niall. Bye.
Bye.